In this collection, you can find all the videos I have made about World War II flying boats and floatplanes up to this point. A mix of American, British, German and Japanese designs. So without further ado, let's begin with Chapter 1, the Kawanishi H-8K flying boat. These big flying boats were used by the Japanese Navy on the Pacific, and they were created after their predecessors showed the same drawbacks we can find on many early World War II Japanese designs. The weak construction, lack of armor plating and insufficient defensive armament, which were usually sacrificed for more range, speed and maneuverability. To understand the history of these flying boats, let's first take a look how the Kawanishi company, well before World War II, started to build its expertise with flying boats, and how those developments led to the H-8K design. The company built several aircraft for the military in the 1920s, and in 1929 the officials tasked them to acquire a new advanced flying boat. So a team of engineers from Kawanishi visited the Short Brothers company in England, looking for suitable designs. After evaluating several types, it was decided to purchase the license to build a modified version of the Short Rangoon flying boat in Japan, which became the Kawanishi H-3K type and was accepted into service in 1932. But only 2 years later, in 1934, the Navy already issued exclusive requirements to Kawanishi for the so-called X-9 project, a big 4-engined monoplane flying boat. These new specifications were extremely ambitious for the time, asking for at least 220 km/h cruise speed and more than 4,500 km range, with powerful armament and ability to carry torpedoes or bombs. And the resulting design was not just the biggest Japanese flying boat, but the biggest Japanese aircraft of its time, featuring the largest wingspan on seaplanes up to that date, with 40 meters. But similarly to many other contemporary Japanese aircraft, the designers had to balance between the extremely ambitious requirements and the relatively underpowered engines available, so their design completely lacked armor plating and fuel tank protection. This type was accepted by the Navy in January 1938 as H-6K1 Navy Type 97 flying boat Model 11. But when the type started flying combat missions over the Pacific, the weakness of the design quickly became obvious. Though they had excellent range, but the H-6K models were very vulnerable to enemy fire. But already back when the H-6K just entered service, the Navy already ordered Kawanishi to develop a larger, more advanced new flying boat. Through 1940, a team at Kawanishi, under the lead of Shizuo Kikuhara, already worked on this new design, using the experience gathered on their former flying boats. And this was the aircraft that eventually became the H-8K. The specifications for the new flying boat again were very ambitious: 450 km/h maximum and 330 km/h cruise speed, around 4,000 km combat range, a maximum combat load between 2,000 and 3,500 kg, and a ferry range between 6,500 and 7,500 km. Kawanishi's new design featured a taller, bigger hull than its predecessor, and instead of a parasol wing, used a conventional high-wing configuration and a single tail. The first prototype was completed in December 1940, and the test flight started in January. Right at the beginning, problems were found on the aircraft. On the takeoff runs, the spray from the bow flooded the wings, inboard engines and the cockpit. It was clear the hull needed a redesign, so with the help of the Tokyo University, changes were made on the aircraft. The hull was increased in depth by 50 cm, the bottom was modified and spray strips were installed to divert the flow. These changes improved water handling by a great margin, so soon the modified prototype was handed over to the Navy for testing. Contrary to the earlier H-6K model, which carried a relatively light bomb load and defensive armament, this new design was finally not constrained by lack of power, as it used 4 Mitsubishi Kasei 11 engines, each of them delivering 1,530 horsepower, which allowed the designers to improve on both offensive and defensive weaponry, based on the experiences gathered on earlier models. The new plane could carry 8 250 kg bombs or 2 torpedoes, and this defensive armament included 5 20mm cannons and additional 3 7.7mm machine guns. The fuel tanks were also armored contrary to its predecessors. and they were designed in a way that if any of them gets punctured, the fuel could be transferred to another tank. The crew protection was also improved over the H-6K type, with the installation of armor plating at crucial areas. During 1941, 2 pre-production models joined the testing, which incorporated further improvements. On the last one, the nose was lengthened by 1.3 meters, the tail fin area increased, and it featured the new Kasei 12 engines. For added protection, now the fuel tanks were also pressurized with the exhaust gases. After completing the test flights, these models were accepted into service in February 1942, under the designation H-8K1 Type II Flying Boat Model 11. However, the production variant's armament had to be reduced. It only featured 2 20mm cannons and 4 machine guns, because of the weight increase after the installation of all necessary equipment. The more powerful armament returned on later variants of the aircraft, so let's now take a look at those. The initial prototype was the experimental Type 13 large flying boat, powered by the Kasei 11 engines, and it carried 5 20mm cannons and 3 machine guns. The H-8K1 was the first production series, powered by the Mitsubishi Kasei 12 engines, but featuring reduced armament. Only 16 units were built, as its upgraded version, the H-8K2 variant, appeared only a few months after the type entered service. In early 1942, the original prototype was tested with the new 1,850 horsepower Kasei 22 engines, and the performance upgrade was immediately noticeable, so the new engines were incorporated into the design, and this upgraded version soon entered production. The increased power allowed the designers to improve the armor protection and increase the defensive armament, which now again included 5 20mm cannons and 4 additional machine guns. The fuel tanks also received the thickest protective coating on any Japanese aircraft of World War II, with approximately 40mm of rubber sheets around them. These models were the most numerous, with 112 units built. Both the H-8K1 and the H-8K2 models had transport variants, the H-8K1L and the H-8K2L, which featured reduced armament and armor protection. The H-8K1L was a single aircraft, modified from the original prototype, while from the H-8K2L model, 36 units were built. Further experimental versions of the type included the H-8K3 variant, which was tested with retractable floats on the wings, but this variant didn't go to production. Only 2 aircraft were modified for testing. They were later rebuilt with Kasei 25B engines and became the H-8K4 models. The H-8K2 was 28.13 meters long, with a wingspan of 38 meters, making it comparable in size to the B-29 Superfortress. It had an empty weight of 18,380 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 32,500 kilograms. The plane was powered by 4 Mitsubishi Kasei 22 air-cooled radial engines, each of them producing 1,850 horsepower. With these engines, despite its size, the plane could reach a top speed of 467 km an hour and a cruise speed of 296 km an hour. It had a range of 7,150 km and a service ceiling of 8,850 meters. The flying boat's defensive armament was impressive. It included 5 20mm cannons in the bow, tail, dorsal turret, and side blisters, plus 5 7.7mm machine guns, which could fire from hatches on the fuselage. The plane could carry either 2,000 kg of bombs or 2 800 kg torpedoes. The first combat mission of the type took place in March 1942 during Operation K, when 2 H-8K1 models took off from the Marshall Islands, refueled from submarines, and attempted to bomb Pearl Harbor, but most of their bombs missed due to bad weather. The type soon took over the long-range maritime patrol and anti-submarine roles from its predecessor, and it was a successful aircraft in these tasks, responsible for sinking many Allied submarines. With its robust construction and very strong defensive armament, the Type proved to be a hard nut to crack for the American pilots, who had to spend a lot of ammunition to bring these planes down. In 1943, after Admiral Yamamoto's G4M bomber transport was shut down, the building of the H-8K2L transport variant started, as the Japanese commanders needed more resilient planes to travel. 4 of these were built as VIP transports, the remaining 32 as troop carriers. By 1944, the improved H-8K3 models were tested, but they didn't enter production. As the tide of the war turned on the Pacific, the flying boats faced more and more American fighters, and despite their strong construction and heavy defensive armament, their losses mounted. By the end of the war, only 4 of these planes remained from the 167 produced. Though the H-8K was a vast improvement over earlier designs, especially in survivability and defensive armament, and it is widely regarded as the best flying boat of World War II, they couldn't really influence the outcome of the war, even though they were very successful designs. Chapter 2: The Dornier DO-18 and DO-24 flying boats. The interwar period was the golden age of the flying boats, used for mail services, cargo and passenger transport all over the world. One of the best amongst them was a German design, the Dornier WWII. Though it was an advanced aircraft for its time, but by the mid-1930s it was a 10-year-old design, as it made its maiden flight in 1922. Still, in 1932, by the request of the German Defense Ministry, a military variant of the type, the DO-J2D, was tested and accepted into service as DO-16. But by winter 1933, the RLM Technical Office already sent new specifications for its replacement to Dornier. While working on this military contract, Dornier also started to negotiate with the Deutsches Lufthansa airline, as they also had plans to replace their DOJ models used for cross-Atlantic mail delivery. Though Lufthansa initially planned for a larger capacity aircraft, they still showed interest in the new design drawn up based on the RLM specifications. The new plane was an elegant all-metal construction, except for the outer wing panels. In many aspects it was similar to its predecessor, featuring a parasol wing holding the engines and the sponsons on the sides. But it had much better aerodynamics and used many high-tech features of the time. The control surfaces used the Junkers double-wing design, and the hull was divided into 7 watertight compartments to improve seaworthiness. The plane could stay afloat as long as no more than 2 of these compartments were flooded. It was designed for the new 600 horsepower UMO 205 diesel engines, which had great fuel consumption, making them the ideal choice for a long-range aircraft. The engines were mounted on the top of the wing in Dornier's signature push-pull tandem configuration. As with many other German military developments of the time, at first this aircraft was also disguised as a civilian design, but the civilian and military variants started their testing almost at the same time. The first prototype DO-18A model made its maiden flight in March 1935, but the planned UMO 205 engines were not ready yet, so it was fitted with earlier UMO 5C diesel engines. This aircraft was later lost in a high-speed trial. The next to fly was the first of the military test variants, the DO-18D, which started its trials late 1935, differing from the civilian version by featuring an open turret in the bow and another gun position in the rear. Mounting points to carry bombs were also added under the starboard wing. The V4 variant featured an experimental twin tail to increase the field of fire, but the production models were reverted back to the single tail design. 3 pre-production units were delivered to Lufthansa in July 1936 as DO-18E models. These variants were powered by the UMO 205C engines, and they performed endurance trials over the Baltic. During the trials, the type managed to fly non-stop for 30 hours and 21 minutes, covering 5,560 kilometers, with 181 kilometers an hour average speed. They started their civilian service on the South Atlantic in April 1937. By this time the military D variant entered service, but deliveries were very slow at the beginning because production of the type was transferred to new factories, and it only picked up in 1938. Until then, only 2 units were fully equipped with this type. Not long after it entered service, the German officials already recognized that the type was quickly getting obsolete. Its performance, and especially its armament, was inadequate. An upgrading program was started to introduce a new variant, featuring the new, more powerful U-Mode 205D engines, modern radio and navigation equipment, and improved armament, including a 13mm machine gun in the nose and a 20mm cannon in the dorsal position, in place of the earlier used 7.92mm guns. Despite its more powerful engines, the performance of the new DO-18G model didn't improve, as the added weight negated the increase in power. This new variant soon completed its trials, but the engine shortage prevented it to enter service until late 1939. This flying boat was 19.23 meters long, with a wingspan of 23.7 meters. It had an empty weight of 6,680 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 8,500 kilograms. The plane was powered by two Junkers U-Mode 205C engines, providing 605 horsepower each. It could reach a top speed of 250 km an hour and a cruise speed of 190 km an hour. Thanks to the diesel engines, the plane's combat range was 3,500 km, and it had a service ceiling of 4,350 meters. Its armament consisted of two 7.92mm machine guns, one in the nose and one in the dorsal position, and its offensive armament was just two 50 kg or 100 kg bombs. When World War II broke out, 36 of these planes operated on the North Sea and 27 on the Baltic. One of them was the unlucky aircraft to become the first Luftwaffe loss to the British forces on 27th of September 1939. The DO-18s participated in the invasion of Poland and later in the invasion of Norway, and flew missions during the Battle of Britain. But it quickly became obvious the slow and weakly armed planes were extremely vulnerable in the reconnaissance role, so they were soon moved to search and rescue missions and later to training roles. But the DO-18's lack of performance was not a surprise to the officials. As early as 1936, they set new requirements for more advanced flying boats, to fill the long-range maritime patrol and search and rescue roles. And with this we arrive to the successor of the DO-18, the DO-24 model. Dornier worked on a new design, which was an evolution of the DO-18, and entered it for these new requirements. But as it turned out, the Blohm and Voss BV-138 was a more promising design, and it was chosen as the primary flying boat for the future. After losing to the Blohm and Voss design, Dornier's new P-14 project was on the brink of cancellation, and the construction of the first two prototypes was stopped. But luckily for the type, the Royal Netherlands Navy was also looking for a new flying boat, to replace their earlier DOJ models, used on the Dutch East Indies. They found the new Dornier design acceptable for their needs, and in August 1936 signed a contract for 6 of the new aircraft, now named DO-24. The V3 and V4 prototypes were finished to the Dutch specifications, and they were equipped with Wright Cyclone engines, instead of the originally planned U-Mode 205C ones. This way they used the same engines as other types already in use on the East Indies by the Dutch Navy. The design followed the elegant lines of the DO-18, but it was bigger, more streamlined, featured 3 engines built in the high-mounted wing, and a twin tail. The V3 model was the first to fly on 3rd of July 1937, and a day later it was handed over to the Dutch Naval Aviation for sea trials. These trials lasted until October, and the seaworthiness of the aircraft was found to be excellent. An order was placed for 11 units, and further 25 were planned to be produced under license. But after the outbreak of the war and the German occupation of Holland, the fully and partially completed models were taken over by the Germans, and entered service with the sea rescue squadrons as DO-24N1 models, which were still built with the Wright engines until the engine supplies lasted. Later, on the DO-24T models, the Cyclone engines were replaced by BMW Bramo 323 models. though the German forces were not interested in using the type as a reconnaissance aircraft, as they already had the BV-138 type. But still the production of the Dornier plane continued during World War II in Holland, and some of them were produced in France as well, as the Sea Emergency Service could use them for search and rescue missions, especially as they still operated the obsolete HG-59 biplanes. Looking at the specifications of the DO-24, we can see it was a more modern design than the DO-18, much more in line with other World War II planes. It was larger than its predecessor, with a length of 22.05 meters and 27 meters wingspan. Its empty weight was 9,400 kilograms and had a maximum takeoff weight of 18,400 kilograms. It was powered by 3 Bramo 323R2 engines, each of them producing 944 horsepower. Thanks to the more powerful engines, the type was able to reach 330 km an hour top speed and had a cruise speed of 295 km an hour. Its combat range was 2,900 km, with a ferry range of 4,700 km, and it had a service ceiling of 7,500 meters. The plane's defensive armament consisted of 2 7.92mm machine guns, one in the nose and one in the tail, and one 20mm cannon in the dorsal turret. It was also able to carry 1,200 kilograms of bombs under the wings. When Germany invaded the Netherlands, they found about a dozen partially built planes, and enough parts to assemble another dozen. Up until 1944, a further 170 units were built in Holland and 48 in France in different configurations. They were used as air-sea rescue planes by the Germans during World War II, and also flew transport missions to supply troops on the Mediterranean and on the Eastern Front. Though on the early N variants the armament was removed, on the later T variants it returned, and it was also improved over time. On the T2 version, an MG151 cannon replaced the original Hispano-Suiza in the dorsal turret, and on the T3 variant, the front and rear gun positions received 13mm machine guns in place of the earlier 7.92mm ones. From the planes originally ordered by the Netherlands, 37 were sent to the Dutch East Indies before the German occupation of the country, and they participated in the fighting against the Japanese forces. One of them, the X-32, was credited for sinking the Japanese destroyer Shinonome on 17th of December 1941. After the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies, 12 of these planes managed to escape to Australia, where 6 of them were put to use by the Australian Air Force, and they stayed in service until mid-1944. Spain also received 12 DO-24s in 1944 to be used as sea rescue planes, and many of those stayed in service well after the war, until 1967. Though these flying boats are not known for their daring stunts or big effect on the events during World War II, they are well known for most people for their elegant looks and long service life in different roles. Chapter 3: The Heinkel HG-59 Floatplane. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, the German Navy and Air Force needed larger floatplanes for the maritime reconnaissance and torpedo bomber role, as the types used at the time, like the Arado WWII or the Heinkel HG-42, were either obsolete or too small for these roles. But during the early 1930s, the German military expansion was restricted by the Versailles Treaty, forced on the country after the First World War. Despite this, many new vehicles were developed in secret, disguised as civilian designs, as it happened for example with the Heinkel HG-111 bomber, which was also presented at first as a civilian airliner. Similarly to other vehicles, the new Floatplane project was also advertised as a civilian passenger or cargo aircraft. When the Reich Marine sent out the requirements to the manufacturers for this new so-called cargo aircraft, the designers at the Heinkel company set to work with the lead of Reinhold Mewes, and the design work on the new aircraft was finished in early 1930. Though the proposed aircraft was a fairly conventional design, not much different from other floatplanes around the world, and it was an old-fashioned biplane with two BMW engines mounted between the wings. But it was the largest plane built by the Heinkel company up to that point, and it was a great way to get more experience with larger float planes. Experience they have put to good use in the upcoming years. Since the requirements asked for an aircraft which can operate both from land and from sea, two separate prototypes were built. The HE-59A variant, which used floats, and the HE-59B with conventional landing gear. None of them carried armament to keep the image of being built for civilian purposes, and they featured slightly different designs. While the land-based variant stored all the fuel in the fuselage, on the A variant the designers made use of the huge floats and used part of them as fuel tanks, increasing the range of the aircraft and freeing up space in the fuselage, which could be used to carry additional fuel or a bigger payload. The land-based B variant was the first to fly in September 1931, followed by the maiden flight of the Floatplane A variant in January 1932. The prototypes were tested all through 1932, and a small batch of pre-production aircraft was built for evaluation. Finally, in 1933, the newly formed RLM accepted the A variant into service. The first batch of 16 production models of the HE-59B1 variant were ordered after the trials, which only differed from the prototype A variant in minor details, and they only featured a single 7.92mm machine gun in the nose. But this small batch was soon followed by other improved versions of the plane, so let's take a look at its variants. The HE-59A was the first prototype using floats. The HE-59B was the second prototype, built with conventional landing gear. This plane was later converted to floats as well. The following HE-59B1 was the first pre-production series, featuring only one machine gun and small changes from the prototypes. The next B2 variants were the first production versions, which to speed up deliveries were now license built at the Arado factory as well. These variants featured a new all-metal nose with bomb aiming panels and glazing for a ventral gun position. Now the plane featured 3 defensive machine guns, one in the nose, one in the ventral and one in the dorsal position. Based on the B2 version, some more specialized variants were developed, like the B3, which to be more suited for long-range reconnaissance carried only 2 machine guns and additional fuel tanks in the fuselage. The C1 variant didn't carry armament and was used for training purposes or long-range reconnaissance missions, and featured a new nose design without the glazing, bombing equipment or armament. The following C2 was a dedicated sea rescue version. Instead of armament, it could carry rescue equipment and 6 inflatable boats. The D1 variant was used for pilot and navigation training and received a new nose section, featuring a canopy and no glazing. The following E1 version was converted from C variants for torpedo training, while the E2 variant was a dedicated photo reconnaissance aircraft. And finally, the N variant was a navigation trainer version. The HE-59 was 17.4 meters long, with a wingspan of 23.7 meters, being somewhat bigger than a B-25 Mitchell bomber. It had an empty weight of 5,010 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 9,119 kilograms. The plane was powered by 2 BMW 6 engines, each of them producing 660 horsepower. The big plane was somewhat underpowered with these engines, and only had a maximum speed of 221 km an hour and a cruise speed of 185 km an hour. It had a range of 942 km and a service ceiling of 3,500 meters. The plane's defensive armament consisted of 3 7.92mm machine guns, and it could carry either 1,000 kg of bombs, or an 800 kg torpedo, or 1,000 kg of sea mines. Deliveries of the first production HE-59s started in 1935. and in the same year the first squadron using these planes was formed. As with many new German designs, their first combat use happened in the Spanish Civil War, where a variation of German aircraft was field tested as part of the Condor region. The HG-59s arrived to Spain in September 1936 on a merchant ship. After the assembly and testing, they immediately started flying combat missions to support the nationalist forces. In January 1937, one of them attacked a Republican cargo ship with a torpedo. And even though they missed the ship, this event was the first aerial torpedo attack since the end of the First World War. Some of these planes used in Spain were modified to carry a 20mm cannon in the nose for anti-shipping operations, instead of the original machine gun. In February 1937, they lost the first of these planes when, under attack by Republican I-15 fighters, it crashed into the sea. During 1937 and 1938, they carried out attacks against shipping and coastal railways. And though they lost several planes, but the replacement ones were constantly ferried over to Spain. By the outbreak of World War II, the HG-59s were mostly considered obsolete. Their production at the Arado factory ceased in 1938, and their successor, the Heinkel HG-115, entered service in 1939, featuring a modern monoplane design with higher speed and bigger range. The HG-59s were still used as frontline aircraft in the first years of the war, but already work started to implement the earlier mentioned modifications to create the dedicated long-range reconnaissance, training, and rescue variants, as the type was getting outclassed more and more in the frontline duty by newer designs. They participated in the invasion of Poland in September 1939, attacking coastal batteries and troops. During these operations, the Germans lost 3 of these planes. In the second half of 1939, they were deployed to the west and started patrolling the Baltic and North Seas, looking for enemy ships and submarines. At the end of the year, together with the newer HG-115s, they started flying missions to the east coast of England, dropping sea mines. They participated in the invasion of Norway and Denmark in April 1940, carrying infantry and artillery troops and flying rescue missions. They were also used during the occupation of Holland, and this is where their most unique combat operation took place. On the 10th of May, 12 of these planes took off from Lake Zwischenau and flew to the Maas River in Rotterdam, carrying German troops to capture bridges before they could be destroyed. The operation was a success. The planes landed near the Willem Bridge, and the German troops managed to capture the bridges before the Dutch forces even realized what was happening. During the Battle of Britain, they flew air-sea rescue missions painted white featuring the Red Cross. But the Allies suspected that under the disguise, the HG-59s were still used to drop mines, and they radioed information back to their base. So despite the Red Crosses, the British declared them valid targets. Their suspicion was confirmed in July 1940, when a HG-59 crew was captured after their emergency landing near Sunderland, and the pilot admitted their main task was to deliver agents and conduct reconnaissance. The plane's covert use now confirmed. From July, the British fighters were instructed to shoot at any German rescue aircraft, and after this, the HG-59 losses quickly mounted. In July and August, the Germans lost 9 of these planes. After the Battle of Britain, the remaining HG-59s were deployed to the Mediterranean and the Black Sea to carry out rescue missions. They were used until the end of 1943, when they were replaced by newer flying boats. Though these planes were designed well before the Second World War, and were outdated even when the war broke out, they took part in interesting missions, and they were important parts of the German war machine. Chapter 4. The Blohm and Voss VV-138 flying boat. Though this plane became famous in World War II as the main flying boat used by the Luftwaffe, its roots reach back in the early 1930s. In the 1920s and 30s, the German flying boats were well known around the world, carrying passengers and cargo everywhere on the globe. Maybe the most well known were the flying boats built by Dornier at that time, like the DOJ and the giant DOX models. The German Air Force also used the Dornier flying boats as long-range maritime patrol planes, utilizing the DO-16 and later the DO-18 models. But soon another manufacturer appeared who demanded a place in this segment of the market, and this was the Blohm and Voss shipbuilding company. Just like many other businesses, they also went through a hard time during the recession in the early 1930s, and to diversify, they established a new aircraft building company, the Hamburger Flugzeugbau. The new company didn't waste time, and soon their designs appeared in almost every civilian and of course in military tenders. Their HA-137 model competed with the famous Ju-87 Stuka for the dive bomber role, and the HA-140 design was the main competitor for the Heinkel HE-115 floatplane. Since the main business of Blohm and Voss was shipbuilding, it was fitting for them to enter the competition when in 1934 the RLM set new specifications for a new long-range maritime reconnaissance aircraft to replace the older Dornier flying boats. Their team, with the lead of Dr. Richard Voss, started working on designs for the new requirements. The resulting aircraft was quite unusual looking for a floatplane. It had a very short hull, featured a twin boom tail, and originally a gull wing design, with two engines positioned close to the wing mounting points. The original plans were to use the new BMW 15 engines, but since the development of these was delayed, the RLM proposed to build multiple prototypes, with different engine configurations, all providing around 1000 horsepower. The V1 was planned to use two BMW engines, and the V2 variant to be built with Daimler DB600 ones. By March 1935, the mock-up of the plane was ready, but instead of the originally planned BMW engines, now it was meant to use the Junkers UMO 206 diesel engines, which developed around 1000 horsepower each. The RLM soon approved the mock-up, and the construction of the first prototype began. By the time the first airframe was ready in late 1936, it became clear the UMO 206 engines will not be available, so the designers had to use the less powerful UMO 205 ones, which only developed 605 horsepower. This led to the addition of a third engine in the center between the wings. In this picture showing the V1 prototype, you can see the original gull wing configuration and the later added third engine in the center. It took more than half a year in the factory to implement the required modifications, so the maiden flight of the type only happened in July 1937. 3 months later, in November, the slightly modified V2 variant joined the testing. But it was quickly discovered the airframe was not strong enough to withstand the open seas, so several modifications were needed to make the type acceptable. As a result, they abandoned the similar third variant, but since the RLM was satisfied with the plane's performance, despite the early problems, the development jumped to the A0 pre-production series, which featured most of the required modifications. Its hull was almost 3 meters longer and became sleeker. The tail booms were redesigned to be stronger, and many other smaller changes were implemented. The initial armament was placed in a powered turret in the front and 2 open positions in the rear. This variant fared well in the trials, and 5 more pre-production variants were ordered to be tested with different engine types. The BV-138 was not only unique amongst the flying boats because of its interesting design, but despite its size, the aircraft could also be launched with a ship catapult. They were also capable of using the Volta rocket boosters, which shortened the takeoff distance by a great margin. A further unique feature was the use of the diesel engines, which were not in high demand, so they were easily available, and as an added plus for a flying boat, they made it possible for the aircraft to land on the sea and refuel from a U-boat if needed. The first production A1 variant featuring all the changes made its maiden flight in April 1940. And though the type still had additional trials to complete, the first 2 aircraft finished were immediately pushed into service in the Norwegian campaign. But the rush into service, of course, took its toll. After the type started flying missions, again new problems were discovered. The operations of the A1 variants over the Bay of Biscay showed the hull, floats, and other parts still need additional reinforcements, and the engines and armament needed modifications as well. This led to the B1 variant, which again featured reinforcements on different areas of the plane, and used the stronger UMO 205D engines, now producing 880 horsepower. And if we're talking about the different versions of the plane, let's take a look at the variants. The V1 and V2 were the first prototypes tested by the RLM. The A01 to A06 variants were the pre-production aircraft, featuring the modified longer hull, stronger tail, and other improvements. The A1 was the first production variant, using the UMO 205C engines producing 605 horsepower. Only 25 were built from this variant, as experiences showed the need for additional changes on the type. The B0 was the next development of the type, featuring structural reinforcements. After the weakness of the hull on the A variant was discovered, the A04 model was sent back to the factory to work out the needed reinforcements, and became the first BV-138B0, the base for the B series. The B1 version was upgraded with the 880 horsepower UMO 205D engines, and featured additional reinforcements based on the experiences gathered during the first combat missions. Only 21 units were built, as the production quickly swapped to the next C1 variant, which was the definitive version, featuring again additional reinforcements, a 4-bladed propeller on the center engine, an enclosed rear gunner position, and many smaller modifications. 227 were built. And finally, the MS variant was a minesweeper version. These planes were converted from existing aircraft. They had their armament removed and carried a large magnetic ring to explode sea mines. The BV-138 was 19.85 meters long, with a wingspan of 26.94 meters. The plane had an empty weight of 11,770 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 17,650 kilograms. It was powered by 3 Junkers UMO 205D engines, developing 880 horsepower each. With these engines, it could reach a top speed of 285 km an hour and a cruise speed of 235 km an hour. It had a range of 1,220 km and a service ceiling of 5,000 meters. The plane's armament consisted of 2 20mm cannons in the front and rear turrets, and one 13mm machine gun in the upper rear position, and optionally one additional machine gun fired by the radio operator. The plane originally could carry 3 50kg bombs or 250kg depth charges under the starboard wing. Later, the U1 modification allowed the same load under the port wing as well, effectively doubling the payload. The type first saw action during the German invasion of Norway in 1940, when the Luftwaffe needed troop transports, and 2 of the pre-production planes were immediately pushed into action. Though at this time the type was still improved quite fast between the variants, by the end of the year it was declared combat ready. The first production models started their service flying reconnaissance missions from France over the Bay of Biscay. During these missions, weaknesses of the A1 variant were discovered, which led to the development of the B1 variant, which featured many reinforced parts. The type was mainly operated by the maritime patrol units of the Luftwaffe. These units were responsible for patrolling the coastal waters of Germany and its occupied territories, as well as conducting long-range reconnaissance missions over the Atlantic, where the BV-138 played a crucial role. Its long range and flight time made it ideal to locate and track Allied convoys, and aid the German U-boats in their missions to disrupt Allied shipping. In addition to the reconnaissance and anti-shipping role, the type was often used as search and rescue aircraft, as they were able to land on rough seas and carry several passengers. They mainly operated on the North Atlantic and the Arctic seas, tracking and attacking convoys heading to both England and to the Soviet Union. After 1943, many of these planes were deployed on the Mediterranean as well, flying missions against Allied shipping. Then as the Allied forces advanced, they were pulled back to the Baltics. As the war progressed and the Allies gained air superiority, these relatively slow planes became more and more rare over the seas. Still, many of them stayed in service until the very end of the war. Though this aircraft was developed years before World War II, and it was a very unique design, it served the Luftwaffe all through the war, and was one of the main maritime patrol aircraft of the German forces. Chapter 5: The PBY Catalina Flying Boat. The origins of this aircraft reach back well before World War II, to the late 1920s. The Consolidated Company at that time was already an established supplier of several different planes for the US Army and Navy, with designs like the PT-1 trainer. But they were determined to break into the market of the larger multi-engine designs as well, as the Army introduced several specifications for new bombers and other type of aircraft at that time. To boost their chances, Consolidated hired Isaac McLean Ledden in 1927, who was an experienced designer of multi-engined aircraft, and they used his expertise in their upcoming designs. As it turned out, hiring him was a very good idea. At Consolidated, he was first involved in the S-37 biplane, which was a joint venture between Consolidated and Sikorsky. This biplane bomber was their offer for the 1927 competition. Though it lost out to its competitors, it provided valuable experience for the company and the design team. The next aircraft a year later was the first step in an evolution that eventually led to the PBY Catalina. The XPY-1 Admiral was a design developed by the Navy and circulated to several aviation companies to place offers on building the prototype. Consolidated won this competition in February 1928. They spent most of the year developing techniques needed to build a new aircraft, and the prototype was finished in December the same year. The test flights went smoothly, and in June 1929 the Navy requested bids from manufacturers for the production of the type. Though Consolidated built the prototype, the production order in the end was awarded to the Martin Company, as their bid was considerably lower than the Consolidated one, which included their engineering costs for the prototype development. So this type entered production as Martin P3M. Consolidated, however, used the experience gathered and developed a commercial flying boat based on the design. This was the Commodore passenger flying boat. Ledden's team also developed a new design from the previous XPY-1, which was a considerable upgrade over the previous version, using many features from the Commodore design as well, like the closed cockpit. This was the P2Y-1, which had a predicted range of around 3,000 miles. The Navy approved the new design and awarded a prototype contract to Consolidated in May 1931. This plane was powered by two 575 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines, and on the first flight test it was even tested with a third engine mounted in the center, but that was quickly removed as the three-engine configuration didn't show significant improvements over the twin-engine variant. Though the first flight of the P2Y-1 only happened in March 1932, the Navy already ordered 23 units of the type in July 1931. But even before deliveries of this flying boat were finished, in mid-1932 the Navy already issued new specifications for its successor. The specifications asked for 3,000 miles of range, 100 miles an hour cruise speed, and a maximum weight of 25,000 pounds. The new designs also had to feature the new Pratt & Whitney XR1830 engines. Ledden and his team designed an entirely new plane for these specifications, using the experiences gathered on the former flying boats. And this was the XP3Y-1, the design that later became the PBY. The Navy, after reviewing the proposal, awarded a contract to Consolidated to build a prototype in October 1933. The main competitor of the Consolidated plane was the Douglas XP3D. Douglas actually received a prototype contract months before Consolidated, and their plane flew in February 1935, more than a month before the XP3Y-1. The first flight for the Consolidated design happened in March 1935. The first tests were successful, but the plane had problems with directional stability and controls. As a result of the instability, the bombing trials in May and June were unsatisfactory. Consolidated modified the rudder to try to fix these problems, but the new design required very high forces to operate and didn't actually fix the stability issues. At the end of July, the prototype was heavily damaged on landing, but luckily the bulkheads held, so the plane was towed back and repaired. At the end of testing, the final report included several recommended changes: improve the waist gunner positions, create a new rear gun position, improve the bomb load, improve the bow gun position, and most importantly, modify the rudder to fix the instability and control issues. Both the consolidated XP3Y1 and the Douglas XP3D passed the test successfully, and they showed very similar performance. So the decision came down to the final factor, the price of the planes. While Douglas priced their design at $110,000 for each aircraft, the consolidated offer with a unit price of just $90,000 was considerably lower. So the Navy chose the consolidated design, and the contract was signed for 60 aircraft. The tail on the aircraft was reworked again, and these modifications made the stability issues acceptable, but it was still not the final fix. After Consolidated implemented the required modifications, the plane was redesignated to XPBY-1. The plane made a final demonstration flight in May 1936, and the first production variant started to arrive to the units in October the same year. But even before that, the Navy already issued another contract to Consolidated for 50 of the PBY-2 variants. And this would be a good time to go over the variants and their distinctive features. The P3Y1 was the early prototype. The XPBY-1 was the modified variant that gone into production as PBY-1. It used two 900 horsepower engines. The PBY-2 was basically similar to the PBY-1 with small improvements. The PBY-3 used stronger 1000 horsepower engines. The PBY-4 had even stronger 1050 horsepower engines, and is the only variant that was built with spinners on the propellers. The next PBY-5 was a bigger redesign. It introduced the bulges on the waist gunner positions, a new tail, and 1200 horsepower engines. The PBY-5A was an amphibian version, featuring retractable wheels. The PBN-1 was a major redesign by the Naval Aircraft Factory. It had a longer nose, a redesigned bottom fuselage, and a redesigned taller vertical stabilizer. The deliveries of the PBN-1 started in 1943, but almost all of these variants were supplied to the Soviet Union. The PBY-6A was similar to the 5A, but featured a new tail, the one from the revised PBN model. It also featured radar and a new ball turret with twin 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. The PB-2B1 was a PBY-5 variant built by Boeing. The PB-2B2 was similar to the PB-2B1, but used a taller new tail from the PBN design. The PBY was 63 feet 10.5 inches long, with a wingspan of 104 feet. It had an empty weight of 20,910 pounds and a maximum takeoff weight of 35,420 pounds. The plane was powered by two Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines, producing 1200 horsepower each. With these engines, it could reach a top speed of 196 miles an hour, a cruise speed of 125 miles an hour, and a range of 2,500 miles. Its service ceiling was 15,800 feet. The plane's defensive armament consisted of 3 30 caliber and 2 50 caliber machine guns, and it could carry up to 4,000 pounds of ordnance, either bombs or depth charges, and torpedo racks were available for the type as well. The PBY entered service in 1936, and until World War II broke out, they participated in some training exercise. Actually, by 1939, the PBY was considered obsolete, and its planned successors, like the Martin XPBM Mariner, the consolidated XPB-2Y Coronado, and the Sikorsky XPBS were already flying by the time the war broke out. But its production still continued, thanks to the large foreign orders Consolidated received from Britain, Canada, Australia, France, and others. Britain ordered 106 units, and deliveries began in November 1940, as Catalina 1 and 2, depending on equipment. The name Catalina was given by the British after the resort island at the California coast, and in 1941 the US forces adopted the name as well. In December 1939, the US Navy also decided to order additional 200 units of the type, as its planned successors were not ready yet. When the PBY first saw combat, it was not a success, as it happened during the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, when almost all of them stationed there were destroyed on the ground. Only the ones flying patrol missions remained unharmed. The engagements in the war showed the vulnerability of the PBY early on. Many of them were lost because of the lack of self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plating. The bad design of the waist gunner positions on the early models didn't help either, as the guns were not belt-fed but used a 50-round canister, which was barely enough for 10 seconds of firing. This was only fixed on the later PBY-5 with the introduction of the new redesigned waist gunner positions. Despite the losses early on, later the PBY turned out to be a very versatile and useful addition to the Allied air power. They were used in anti-submarine role, as patrol aircraft, convoy escorts, search and rescue planes, and so on. Built by bigger numbers than any other flying boat, it was the most widely used type for these roles. They were used in the anti-submarine role both on the Pacific and on the Atlantic, and they sunk numerous submarines. Their role as a maritime patrol aircraft resulted in their participation in some of the most important and most well-known engagements of the war. In May 1941, it was one of these planes that located the German battleship Bismarck, as it tried to get away from the chasing Royal Navy. The PBY patrol plane spotted the Japanese fleet before the Battle of Midway in June 1942, giving the US forces the upper hand in the clash. But they were not only used as patrol aircraft. The plane's vulnerability was a big drawback in daytime missions, but the effective use of the radar on later models helped them become a good night attack aircraft. Maybe the most successful was the so-called Black Cat tactics, nighttime search and attack missions. These raids successfully attacked the Japanese supply shipments, moved under the darkness of the night. Some of these planes were modified for bigger firepower, like this model with dual 50 caliber machine guns installed in the nose, or another example featuring a 20mm cannon. Though it is not as well known, all PBYs were able to carry torpedoes as well, and they made good use of these in their attack missions. But maybe the most remembered role these planes were used in was the search and rescue operations. The missions codenamed Dumbo saved the lives of many airmen who were picked up from the ocean or from small islands during the war. Maybe the most famous of them was the PBY saving dozens of sailors after the sinking of the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, when they took on board as many men as it was possible and waited for the rescue ships. As the plane was so overloaded, it wouldn't have been able to fly. After World War II ended, the US Navy quickly retired the PBY as newer designs took its place. Only the amphibious version stayed active for some time, the last of them retiring in 1957. The type was used longer in other countries though. Many of them flew actively well into the 1970s. One of them was a participant in a Cold War incident, which was named after it. The so-called Catalina incident happened in 1952, when a Swedish Catalina was shot down by a Soviet MiG-15 fighter over the Baltic Sea. Many of the Catalinas were used for civilian purposes, some modified as firefighters, some built as flying yachts. Though this aircraft was considered obsolete even before World War II broke out, and seemed it will be retired soon, it not only served through the war in many roles, showing how versatile it was, but in many countries served for decades, and found new roles in civilian life as well. It deserved its fame as it performed in any role it was given. Chapter 6. The Heinkel HE-115 Floatplane. In the 1930s, the German Luftwaffe needed floatplanes to supplement the Navy, as the only bigger two-engine aircraft in service was the Heinkel HE-59. The development of this aircraft started way back in 1931, and even by the time it entered service, it was clearly outdated, as monoplanes started to take over the roles of the biplane designs. The HE-59, though it was still used for various roles during World War II, was clearly outdated, and only saw combat in the first months of the war. After that, they were only used as training, transport, or sea rescue planes. Though this type only entered service in 1935, the same year the RLM already posted new requirements for its successor. The new aircraft had to be a faster twin-engine monoplane design, which can be used in multiple roles, like reconnaissance, maritime patrol, or anti-shipping operations. Heinkel already had a lot of experience with floatplanes and flying boats, and supplied many types to the military and the civilian market. They entered their HE-115 design, and the main opponent for the Heinkel aircraft in this tender was the Blohm and Voss HE-140. The preliminary comparisons showed that the two designs had very similar characteristics, so prototypes were ordered from both manufacturers. The HE-115 made its maiden flight in August 1937, but according to the first experiences, the new aircraft had terrible flight characteristics, and it was actually terrifying to fly. This prompted a series of improvements on the design, especially after Ernst Udet, the head of development at the Luftwaffe, told Heinkel the aircraft will never be accepted in such a state. The design team made several modifications, and power-assisted control surfaces were used to make the controls less heavy, resulting in a completely different report a few weeks later, now praising the new design as easy to fly. Its rival, the HE-140, was finished a bit later than the Heinkel design, and made its maiden flight in September the same year. But the first prototype was soon lost in an accident, so the V2 variant participated in the comparison trials. During the trials, the HE-115 was declared superior, as it had much lower takeoff and landing speeds, and actually its rival was again damaged on landing, breaking one of the floats and one of its engines. Still, after the winner was declared, the work on it continued for a while as a backup for the HE-115, but finally in September 1939 the program was terminated. In March 1938, the V1 prototype of the HE-115 performed a record-breaking 7-hour 15 minutes long-distance flight, loaded with 2,000 kg weight and setting 8 world speed records. The prototype was modified for this attempt, with a new nose design, a more streamlined cockpit, and various aerodynamic improvements on the fuselage. Another record-breaking attempt a year later, to fly the aircraft to South America, covering 10,000 kilometers, failed. As about two-thirds of the way, the portside engine developed an oil leak, and the crew had no other choice than to land the aircraft near a German steamer, the Monte Pascual. They were taken aboard along with the plane and arrived to South America aboard the ship. Speaking of modifications, the first prototypes, the V1 and V2, originally featured the first variant of the nose design, which wasn't very aerodynamic or elegant, and was built like that to allow the gunner to operate the gun in a half-upright position. The following V3 featured a new glazed nose, a much sleeker design, where the nose gunner could operate the gun in a prone position. The V4 variant featured a new rudder, and this was the last version with wire-supported floats. After this version, all planes featured rigid bracing on the floats. This variant became the base for the first A0 and A1 production variants. The later V5 variant became the base for the B-series aircraft. And with that we arrived to the variants of the HE-115. As we mentioned, the first A-series was based on the V4 version. The pre-production A0 variant only featured one machine gun in the dorsal position, and the next A1 version introduced the second nose-mounted machine gun. The A2 was an export variant identical to the A1, but supplied without weaponry to Norway and Sweden. The following A3 version featured new communications equipment and revised weapons bay. The B1 series was based on the V5 prototype, featuring increased fuel capacity and range of weapons. The stronger airframe allowed the maximum takeoff weight to be raised above 10,000 kilograms. The B1R1 version was a reconnaissance variant carrying cameras. The B1R2 was a bomber variant with the capability to carry 500 kilograms of bombs. And the R3 was the mine layer version, with the ability to carry 2 500 kilogram or 1,000 kilogram mines. The following B2 line was identical to the B1, but featured reinforced floats with ice runners. The next C variant introduced heavier armament, featuring 15 or 20mm cannons in the nose, and optionally it could also carry rear-firing machine guns in the engine nacelles. The Plan D variant was skipped because it was designed to use the BMW 801 radial engines, but those were needed for the FW-190 fighters. The last E model entered production in 1943, despite the HG-115 production officially stopped in early 1940, but apparently the wartime needs required the production to restart in 1943. The HG-115 was not a small aircraft. With a length of 17.3 meters and a wingspan of 22.2 meters, it was comparable to most medium bombers. The aircraft had an empty weight of 5,290 kilograms, and the maximum takeoff weight was 10,400 kilograms. It used two BMW 132K air-cooled radial engines, producing 960 horsepower each. With these power plants, the plane could reach a maximum speed of 327 km an hour. It had a combat range of 2,100 km and a service ceiling of 5,200 meters. The armament of the aircraft consisted of three 7.92mm machine guns, and some of the C variants had fixed 15 or 20mm cannons in the nose. The plane could carry either 5 250kg bombs, or 2 bombs and 1 torpedo, or optionally a 1000kg sea mine. The first time for the HG-115 in a war environment was during the Spanish Civil War, when two of them flew to Mallorca in early 1939 for a so-called Mediterranean corrosion test. They flew several reconnaissance missions with Spanish markings without enemy contact during their short stay, before returning to Germany in May. They saw constant use in the early part of World War II, mainly on the Baltic and North Seas. Their most frequent use was laying mines, but during this period they were used actively as torpedo bombers against Allied ships and convoys as well, as the lack of air defenses on the ships allowed them to operate with relative safety. This, however, didn't last long, as with the introduction of escort carriers and increasing armament on the convoys, their losses started to mount. During the invasion of Norway, both sides operated the type, as the Norwegians ordered a few of these planes before the war broke out. When the country capitulated, 4 of these Norwegian planes escaped to England. The exiled Norwegian government initially wanted to use these planes to drop leaflets over the bigger cities in their country, but luckily the British intervened and shut this operation down, as it clearly would have been suicide. Later these planes were used by the RAF for covert operations, flown by the original Norwegian crews. Another Norwegian plane flew to Finland. It was interned by the Finns and used against the Soviets. Sweden also operated the type, as they ordered 12 of them before the outbreak of the war. They were actually kept in service until 1952. As the war progressed, more advanced designs overshadowed the HG-115 in most of its intended roles, especially in the anti-shipping raids, where the big slow plane became increasingly vulnerable. They were still used in the mine-laying role, but during the Battle of Britain suffered heavy losses, mainly from the British coastal air defense. As we mentioned, the production of these planes actually ceased in 1940, but it was restarted in 1943 with the E model. Though clearly outdated by this time, they stayed in service until the end of the war, but instead of combat roles, they were used for transport, reconnaissance, and mostly for covert operations to deliver agents to their targets. Though the HG-115 became obsolete early in World War II, it is still regarded as one of the most successful float planes of the war, and though it's not as glamorous as some other aircraft of the era, it is very much worth remembering. Chapter 7. The short Sunderland flying boat. The story of the Sunderland actually starts in the late 1920s, when its predecessor, the short Seraph, was proposed as a reconnaissance aircraft. This big 6-engined flying boat first flew in 1932, but it wasn't a very successful design. So a year later, in November 1933, the Air Ministry already issued new specifications for its replacement. The requirements included similar or better performance than the Seraph, but more compact size, only using 4 engines, a range of 1600 miles, a service ceiling of 15,000 feet, ability to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, and 4 defensive armament positions. Not long after the Air Ministry specifications were announced, the Short Brothers Company also received a request from Imperial Airways to build a large modern flying boat for overseas flights. During the 1920s and 1930s, the transatlantic flights used flying boats with several stops, as the civil passenger planes of the time lacked the range to make the trip without landing, and the lack of well-built airfields on the way made the flying boat a necessity. There were several successful designs, like the Dornier DOX, but the British were a bit behind in this segment of aircraft design. The team at Short, with the lead of Arthur Gogh, started working on the design for the Air Ministry's new specifications, but at the same time they worked on the Imperial Airways request as well. They actually prioritized the S-23, the civilian design, as the airline pressed them to design and build the new planes quickly, and even before the first flight happened, already placed an order for 28 of the new flying boats in 1935. Even though the priority was the civilian design, it shared many similarities with the military one, so that one came along as well. The civilian design eventually became the Short Empire flying boat, which first flew in 1937. The S-25 military design took a bit longer, and Short only entered their proposal to the Air Ministry in late 1934, a year after the specifications were announced. Though several manufacturers entered their proposal, like Supermarine with their Type 232 design, the main rival for the Short S-25 was the Sunderland A-33. After the initial evaluation, the ministry ordered prototypes from both designs. The Sunderland A-33 received the serial K4773, and the Short S-25 received serial K4774. By March 1936, before the prototypes were even completed, the ministry issued contracts for 11 units of both designs. In July, their confidence in the Short design grew further, as almost the same time as the final conference was held on the S-25 proposal, its sibling, the Short Empire, made its maiden flight without any problems. The Air Ministry only asked for a few changes on the initial design. The plans for the 37mm cannon were dropped, and the tail gunner position received a power turret with 4 machine guns. This made the aircraft somewhat tail-heavy, which later required changes on the wings. For the first flights, however, the prototype still featured the original straight wings, and some ballast were added in the nose to counter the heavy turret in the tail. The planned Bristol Pegasus 22 engines were also not available for the first flight, so slightly weaker Pegasus 10 engines were fitted, delivering 950 horsepower each. The maiden flight happened in October 1937, and the plane flew for 45 minutes without any problems. After 4 more test flights, the K4774 returned to the factory for a refit, receiving 4.25 degree sweep on the wings to counter the tail heaviness, and the new Pegasus 22 engines developing 1010 horsepower each. The first flight with the new wings and engines happened in March 1938, and just a month later, the first plane was ready from the already ordered 11. The aircraft showed very good performance. At 150 miles an hour cruise speed, it had 2,750 miles range. It was well equipped for the long flights, thanks to its size. The interior was quite spacious, included 6 bunks where the crew could rest, a kitchen, a mess hall, toilet, and even a machine shop for small repairs. As you can see on these pictures, the word spacious might actually be an understatement for the Sunderland. The design of the plane also included many smart features. The hull was built with bulkheads, separating 6 parts, so in case of penetration the plane would not sink easily. When mooring the aircraft, the front turret was able to slide back to give access to the nose, and the Sunderland was the first flying boat equipped with power turrets. As it turned out, in the end it actually never had to prove itself in a fly-off against its competitor, the A-33. The K4773 prototype, when it finally started flight tests almost a year after the Sunderland, in October 1938, had bad performance on water, showing heavy purposing. And just 44 days later, it suffered a wing failure during a takeoff. The prototype was unrepairable, and the ministry cancelled the contract, leaving the Sunderland without a competitor. The first Mark I Sunderlands started to arrive to their units in June the same year. The S-25 was the original prototype, fitted with 950 horsepower Pegasus 10 engines. Later it was modified with sweep in the wings and the originally planned 1010 horsepower Pegasus 22 engines. The Mark I was the production version of the S-25, and it was basically identical to the late model prototype. Late 1940, a second machine gun was added to the nose turret, and 2 others on each side at the waist gunner positions. 90 units were built. The Mark II received stronger Pegasus 18 engines, equipped with 2-stage superchargers, developing 1065 horsepower. It also featured a new tailgun turret, which allowed for more ammo storage, and later in the production, the 2 waist gunner openings were deleted, and a dorsal turret installed, with 2 7.7mm machine guns. Only 43 were built from this variant, with the introduction of the next Mark III version. The Mark III featured a bigger redesign on the hull. The earlier edge on the hull bottom was changed to a faired mainstep design. This resulted in about 10% less drag. They also featured the ASV Mark II and later the Mark III radars. The defensive armament was constantly upgraded on the Sunderlands. From 1943, the Mark IIIs, apart from the earlier front, rear and dorsal turrets, could feature additional 2 or 4 7.7mm machine guns in the nose, fired by the pilots, and sometimes 50 caliber machine guns firing through beam hatches. 461 Mark IIIs were built. The Mark IV was a big modification of the type, intended to be used on the Pacific. They featured stronger 1700 horsepower Bristol Hercules engines, a longer hull and upgraded defensive armament, with 250 caliber machine guns in the nose and tail turrets, additional 2 on each sides, and 2 more forward-firing ones. The dorsal turret carried 2 20mm cannons. The bigger size and added equipment raised the maximum weight of this version to 75,000 pounds. Only 8 of these were built, and they changed so much that they received a new name as S-45 Seaford. The Mark V variant was a result of the constant weight increase on earlier models. While the Mark I had a maximum weight of 56,000 pounds, the Mark II and III weighted around 58,000 pounds. As a result, the Mark III Sunderlands had their engines running almost at full speed constantly, and they couldn't keep altitude if they lost 2 engines. Followed by suggestions from Australian crews about using the stronger Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines, rated at 1200 horsepower, trials were conducted in 1944. The results were better performance with no drawbacks, so the production was switched to the Mark Vs. 155 units were built, and 33 earlier models were converted to these specifications. The Sunderland was 85 feet 4 inches long, with a wingspan of 112 feet 9.5 inches. It had an empty weight of 34,500 pounds and a maximum takeoff weight of 58,000 pounds. It was much bigger and heavier than the PBY Catalina and bigger than a B-17 bomber. The plane used 4 Bristol Pegasus 18 radial engines, producing 1065 horsepower each. With these engines, it could reach a maximum speed of 210 miles an hour and a cruise speed of 178 miles an hour. It had a range of 1,780 miles and a service ceiling of 17,200 feet. The defensive armament consisted up to 10 machine guns, but that could change between versions and even on individual planes. The usual setup was 2 7.7mm machine guns in the nose turret, 4 7.7mm machine gun in the tail turret, and 2 7.7mm machine guns in the dorsal turret. Additionally, sometimes they carried 50 caliber machine guns in the beam hatches, and even 2 or 4 fixed forward-firing 7.7mm machine guns. The plane could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or depth charges. These were carried internally and loaded onto carriers, and they could be rolled out under the wings before action. The first Sunderlands entered service in June 1938, and at the breakout of World War II, the RAF had 39 of them in 3 squadrons. They started their wartime operations on 3rd of September 1939, patrolling shipping lanes. Apart from long-range patrol and anti-submarine duties, the Sunderlands many times rescued crews from torpedoed ships. Although this was a dangerous task, as the plane's hull was not designed to withstand the strong open sea waves, and they had to be careful when picking up survivors, as even a lifeboat could pierce the hull of the plane. The first successful attack against the submarine came in January 1940, when a Sunderland bombed the already damaged U-55. But the first unassisted kill from the type came only a few months later, in July. Though the Sunderland was mainly built for anti-submarine operations, at first they were not very successful at that. The 250 and 500-pound bombs they were equipped at the beginning were not very effective against the U-boats. But by 1943 these were replaced with newer, more effective depth charges, and these helped the Sunderland to establish itself as a very effective anti-submarine aircraft. This year marked the height of the German U-boat operations and the efforts of the Sunderlands to counter them. To help the planes fight their target, the equipment included the AS-3 Mark II radar, which was later upgraded to the Mark III variant to counter the German Metox radar warning system. The new equipment and the efforts of the crews paid off as the merchant ship losses started to decline and the U-boat losses started to rise. The Germans, to combat the planes, started to equip their submarines with 20 and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, which in return led to the Sunderlands mounting forward-firing machine guns to try to suppress the U-boat guns while approaching for a bomb run. They flew long patrol missions and convoy escorts over the Atlantic, where they hunted the U-boats. But closer to Europe, the patrols were more eventful, as the Sunderlands often came under attack by German planes. But thanks to their constantly evolving defensive armament and their ability to take punishment, they often managed to fend off the attacking planes, earning the nickname Porcupine from the Germans. Many times their size was put to good use in transport role, for example during the evacuation of Greece and Crete, where they were used as troop transports. They also operated on the Mediterranean, patrolling the shipping routes and protecting convoys, and the type was supplied to other allied nations like Australia, New Zealand, France, and Norway. After the war ended, they still stayed in service on the Far East, until 1958 with the RAF and until 1967 with the New Zealand Air Force. They participated in the Berlin airlift in 1948, carrying goods to the isolated city. Some of them also participated in the Korean War, flying missions from Japan until 1954. The short Sunderland was designed way before World War II, and there were plans to replace them in 1941, but in the end they stayed in service and had a great role in securing the shipping lanes on the Atlantic from the German U-boats, and after the war they were used for decades in many parts of the world. Chapter 8. The Kawanishi H-6K Flying Boat. These big flying boats were used by the Japanese Navy on the Pacific during the first part of the war, but when they encountered the newer heavily armed American fighters and patrol bombers, they proved to be an easy target for the Allied gunners. The American crews were very surprised to see how these giant planes burst into flames after just a few hits and plunged into the ocean. As it turned out, chasing performance and long range made these flying boats too fragile for heavy combat use. So let's go back in time and see how and why they were created this way. Their history actually started more than a decade before World War II, when the Kawanishi company started to build its expertise with flying boats. Before World War II, the planned Japanese expansion on the Pacific raised the question of long-range reconnaissance and bomber aircraft as a requirement to fight a war on the vast ocean. Since the land-based aircraft would have needed airfields built on almost every island, the flying boats were a logical choice for these roles. The Kawanishi Aircraft Company built several planes for the military in the 1920s, and they were tasked in 1929 to acquire a new advanced flying boat. This led to Kawanishi's team visiting the United Kingdom, looking for a suitable aircraft at the Short Brothers Company. Their visit led to the purchase of the right to build a modified version of the Short Rangoon flying boat under license. This type, now built in Japan, became the Kawanishi H-3K and was accepted into service in 1932. But in the same year, lots of changes happened in the Navy administration, and the new leadership set out to raise the quality of the Navy aircraft and also replaced the license-built planes with pure Japanese designs. As the most experienced Japanese company building flying boats, Kawanishi received specifications for a new experimental flying boat in 1933. They worked out two designs for these requirements: the 4-engined Type Q and the 3-engined Type R flying boats. But after the Navy examination, none of these designs advanced further than scaled model testing. In the next year, however, the Navy issued exclusive requirements to Kawanishi for the so-called X9 project, a big 4-engined monoplane flying boat. As it usually happened with Japanese requirements of the time, these new specifications were extremely ambitious. The new design had to be able to outperform all the Western designs in production at the time. Or to put it simply, it had to be the best of the world. They asked for at least 220 km/h cruise speed and more than 4,500 km range, with powerful armament and ability to carry torpedoes and bombs. Using the experience they gathered with flying boats, the Kawanishi company presented their new so-called Type S design to these 1934 requirements. The new aircraft, designed under the lead of Yoshio Hachiguchi and Shizuo Kikuhara, was a big monoplane with a twin tail, and it was powered by 4 Nakajima Hikari 2 air-cooled radial engines. To achieve the required speed and range, the design featured the largest wingspan on seaplanes up to that date, with 40 meters. And it was not just the biggest Japanese flying boat, but the biggest Japanese aircraft of its time. On the other hand, because the designers had to balance between the extremely ambitious requirements and the relatively underpowered engines available, similarly to many other contemporary Japanese aircraft, it completely lacked armor plating and fuel tank protection. The first prototype of the Kawanishi design was finished in summer 1936 and made its maiden flight on 14th of July without any big problems, and only slight modifications to the hull were required for better handling of water. After the initial test flights, the prototype was handed over to the Navy for evaluation at the end of the month. Though the type fulfilled the Navy's requirements, they found it slightly underpowered with the original 840 horsepower engines. The second and third prototypes were delivered during 1937, and the fourth one in 1938. During the testing, several small modifications were made to the type, mainly on the control surfaces. And to fix the lack of power, during 1937 the original engines were replaced with 1000 horsepower Mitsubishi Kinsei 43 types, raising the total power from 3360 horsepower to 4000. The type with the new modifications was accepted by the Navy in January 1938 as H6K1 Navy Type 97 Flying Boat Model 1, and it was ordered into full production with a contract for 200 units. The armament for the type was planned to be 3 7.7mm machine guns, one in the nose, one in the tail, and one in the dorsal turret, and the plane had the capability to carry either 2 torpedoes or 1000 kg bombs under the wings. But as with many other Japanese military planes, the designers' efforts to comply with the requirements resulted in a very vulnerable design, hurting the performance of these planes on the long run, even though many modifications were made to the type during production. So let's take a look at those next. The initial prototypes were the H6K1 variants tested by the Navy. The first 10 production models featuring armament and the stronger 1000 horsepower engines received the designation H6K2, and 2 of these models were modified to personnel transport as H6K3 models. During production, further modifications were applied to the type. The fuel capacity was increased, the dorsal turret was deleted, and 2 waist gunner positions were added instead, and the machine gun in the tail was replaced with a 20mm cannon. These updated variants received the H6K4 designation, and were the most numerous variant of the type, with more than 120 units built. In 1942, a further upgraded variant of the type, the H6K5 appeared, which featured new 1300 horsepower Kinsei 53 engines, and a machine gun turret was installed behind the cockpit. 36 units were built from this variant. There were also transport variants built without armament. 14 units of the H6K2L unarmed transport variants were made, and a further 20 units based on the H6K4 were built without armament, under the designation H6K4L. In total, between 1936 and 1943, 215 units were built, including the prototypes. The Kawanishi H6K4 model was 25.63 meters long, with a wingspan of 40 meters. It had an empty weight of 11,707 kilograms and a maximum takeoff weight of 21,500 kilograms. The plane was powered by 4 Mitsubishi Kinsei 43 air-cooled radial engines, each of them producing 1,000 horsepower. With these engines, the big flying boat was able to reach a top speed of 340 km an hour and a cruise speed of 222 km an hour. It had a service ceiling of 9,600 meters and a combat range of 4,800 kilometers, with a ferry range of more than 6,000 kilometers. The plane's defensive armament consisted of 3 7.7mm machine guns, 1 in the nose and 2 in the waist gunner positions, and a 20mm cannon in the tail. The secondary armament consisted of either 2 torpedoes or 1,000 kilograms of bombs. The Kawanishi H6K entered service in 1938, and their first combat actions took place in the Sino-Japanese War. When the War on the Pacific broke out, 66 of these flying boats were in service with the Japanese Navy, and they proved to be very useful with their more than 4,000 kilometers range for conducting long-range reconnaissance or attack missions. They participated in the attacks against Baker Island and Wake Island. They also bombed a Dutch seaplane base at Heron, and they also attacked Rabaul. But very soon these combat missions highlighted the weakness of the aircraft. Though their excellent range was very useful in the reconnaissance role, they were vulnerable when attacking enemy installations. The unprotected, big and slow aircraft was an easy target for ground fire and Allied fighters. Soon the type was withdrawn from direct combat missions, and they were assigned to reconnaissance roles. By the end of 1941, a new, more advanced flying boat, the Kawanishi H-8K, was already in the works, which featured more protection and defensive armament. While preparations were made for the production of the new type, the H-6K was further improved with the H-6K5 variant, which, thanks to its 1,300 horsepower engines, now could reach a top speed of 390 km an hour. But only 36 were built from this variant, as in 1942 the production lines were shifted to the new H-8K model. In the later phases of the war, the H-6K flew less and less reconnaissance missions, as they were slowly replaced by newer types, and their main use was to fly cargo missions. But despite the more advanced H-8K Emily entering service, the old Mavis served all the way to the end of the war, though only 12 of them remained in service by that time. Though the Kawanishi H-6K quickly showed its weakness during World War II, but it was an excellent showcase of the pre-war Japanese plane building expertise, and it was the biggest aircraft in Japan when it appeared. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.